Good morning, everybody. My name is Rod Bowles, and I'm a member of the Positive and Safe team at CNTW. And I'm going to be your host this morning, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all to this very special partnership between TEWV and CNTW for the postgraduate certificate and continuous professional development session this morning. And this follows on very nicely from the conferences that we've had over the last couple of years, as the Positive and Safe conferences, again in partnership with our colleagues from TEWV, and they have been part or under the auspices of the Northern Region Reducing Restrictive Interventions Network. And stop presses, an important date for your diaries, is the 15th of October next year. That's a Friday, because we've just agreed with colleagues from the conference, and we're really excited about that. But there will be more information to come. So, as Rebecca has said, this session is being recorded, and it will be part of continual professional development. So it will be available for colleagues, and there will be further details at a later date. It's been recorded with a live audience. That's us, hopefully, and that consists of the postgraduate certificate delegates, and also members of the Positive and Safe teams from TEWV and CNTW. So just for Geoff's experience, there's a great breadth of experience in the room, Geoff, and staff coming from just about all specialities across the two trusts, which should be really interesting. And we hope that people have done their preparatory work and looked at the video, and if not, they'll need to stay behind and explain to Rebecca why.
See me after class.
Stephen and Rebecca and members of the PGC team have devised, in collaboration with Geoff, a really interesting program for this morning. So I think that will be really interesting. We're really looking forward to it, and there will be more about that as time goes on. So without further ado, I'm going to start to introduce Geoff. Geoff Brennan is a very dear friend and colleague who lots of you may know from the of working collaboratively with Len Bowers at the Institute of Psychiatry with regard to safe wards and other things, obviously, during his long and industrious career. And Geoff has held many posts and done many things in his time. He started off as a support worker, and he's worked his way up as clinical lead ward manager, nurse consultant, and latterly he's been the chief exec of Bright, the social care charity, and also the executive director of Star Wards. And he's done that for over 6 years. It would be absolutely remiss of me not to mention the news that came out yesterday from Bright to say that very sadly they will be ending as a charity at the end of the year. But let's not dwell on that. Let's remember the 16 incredible years that Bright has been around with regard to Star Wards and inspiring and empowering patients, carers, service users and staff here and internationally. So on a brighter note, do you see what I did there? On a brighter note, Geoff was recently recognised in the RCNI Awards and received the Mental Health Nurse of the Year award, which I think is an absolutely fantastic achievement. And to quote the judges, they described Geoff as a pioneering mental health nurse who's helped transform the care of service users here and overseas. And for me, that doesn't really sum it up. It's almost like saying Mother Teresa helped lots of people. There's things during his the last thing I just wanted to say is a very warm welcome to you, Geoff. We are all really looking forward to this, and over to you now for your talk on motivating inpatient wards.
Thank you very much, Rod. Yeah. Oh, I'm a bit taken aback by that presentation, to be honest. I think. Thank you. Yes, we won't dwell too much on the difficulties of keeping Bright alive, but just say the websites we are determined will continue, so people will still be able to access the ideas. And I guess for me, the most important bit to add on to that was I worked on wards for a lot of years. Pride, I have to say. And some of my talk today will be a little bit of kickback against the negativity that often surrounds wards, but I do that with because I think they're dreadful places. I think we all agree with that. These are terrible places and people go through terrible things, but the people who work in there are work incredibly hard to take away some of the pain and trauma that people arrive with. So my presentation today, as ever, will be a homage to everybody who works in wards, trying to make them as good as they possibly can, and often succeeding against the odds, which is what Star Wards indeed was all about, and indeed Safe Wards is all about as well. Okay, so how do I do this? Do I go on to my, but thank you, Rod, thank you very much. How do I get on to, do I just click on PowerPoint and it all comes up? Is that how it works?
So in your toolbar, there's a share screen option, Geoff, which is a yeah. So depending on what version of Teams you have, it'll either be when you move your cursor in the middle of your screen or across the top. Across the top. Sorry, I should have probably done all this beforehand.
It might be next to the leave button, Geoff. It might be next
and then there's
to the
a box
button.
with an upwards arrow in it.
I've got a closed share tray. That's probably right. Okay, Bob. Sorry.
So if you've opened up the share tray, if you've got the document open on your computer, then just click on that and it should share.
Is it
there? We are. We can see that.
Fantastic. Look at that.
As if by magic.
As if by magic. Wonderful. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to concentrate now on my talk. Can people talk to me, or is there a kind of chat box or?
So yeah, people can talk, and there is a chat function. So Paul and I will monitor chat and let you know if you wanted some interactive stuff there, Geoff.
Yeah, just a couple of questions and a little quizzy type things, just because otherwise it's 9:30 in the morning, everybody will be falling asleep. So, but yeah, today I wanted to talk about motivating inpatient wards and really kind of talk about, or come to eventually talk about Star Wards and Safe Wards, which is the two things I've been most heavily involved with. I know that people are going off to do sort of projects from this CPD, and in many ways I kind of want to fuel your ideas and perhaps just give you some thoughts about what perhaps those projects could look like. I mean, I'm not saying you do anything from this, but it's just about sharing with you some of the things that I've been thinking. And also because I think whatever we do, the key thing is that we motivate the staff and patients on wards. And as we'll get to the end of it, you'll see that the only real change agents on wards are in fact the staff and the patients that work there. Throughout the course of this, I will be talking about these two wonderful people you see in this picture. The top one with the dog is Marion Janner. We'll come to Marion later and her fantastic work on Star Wards. And the one underneath is Len Bowers. That's a younger Len Bowers. I always pick this picture because he's older now. He's retired, but and he's actually smiling, which is rare for Len. So so that's Len. And also just, I mean, I don't put my titles up there for any kind of look how clever I am, but I just want people to be aware that I'm both learning disabilities and mental health nurse trained, and I've retained my learning disabilities registration, and I'm very proud of it. So because I know there's some people from learning disabilities here. Okay, so I always like with wards, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I'm going to look at wards, inpatient wards, because that's where I work. That's where restricted practices tend to be focused. But I just want to make one kind of comment about wards, and it's about the own, you know, if we look at all our services, we look at early intervention services, community care services, whatever services we're looking at. Wards, in a way, are kind of fossils. They're fossils from an older era, the era of the kind of the asylum. And I think sometimes that's forgotten. There's very little evidence around wards. They've just kind of rolled through the machinations, and we still have them. And I think their history is really quite fascinating, and how they modern healthcare system gives us some of the issues that we're now kind of trying to address. So I'm a great believer in knowing where they come from, and perhaps trying to stand above the noise of the everyday problems we have, and trying to see how did wards get to where they are today, because we're constantly looking to improve them. But to do that, we need to understand where they've actually come from. So I want us just to take a dip into history. And actually, when you do look into history, and I'm going to look at the asylum history very quickly. I'm not going to give you a history lesson in the asylums, but the asylums really came into play in 1845 with an Act of Parliament called the County Asylums Act, where people were very concerned in 1844 about the state of care of what was then termed as lunacy. And they actually went around the country and had a look at all the private asylums and different asylum conditions. And one of the places, and they produced a report called the Lunacy Report in 1844, and this censured 6 asylums, one of which you'll be pleased to hear was in Durham, the West Auckland Private Lunatic Asylum in Durham. And it was criticised, one of 6 that were criticised, because of its use of restrictive practices. It was a small asylum. I think it had 23 people. And the report says that basically 5 men were being locked in a room because there was fear they were going to abscond. I mean, they didn't use that language then. This is 1844. But I did think it's quite fascinating that if we don't understand history, we're just continually kind of cycling it round. But that was something I find when kind of looking into the birth of the asylums. But of course, as we now know, the asylums have all gone. So I also did a little bit of digging around in your part of the world, and I thought it might be interesting to see if people know where these old asylums are. So I've got 3 asylums for you to look at, and one's in Durham, one's in Cumberland, one's in Cumbria, and one's in Middlesbrough. So let's see if people know where these asylums were. Does anybody know? And don't be hoodwinked by the Durham County Mental Hospital Cemetery sign. It wasn't actually called Durham County Mental Hospital. I wonder if anybody knows where that is or what it was. This was the Asylum for the Lunatic Paupers of Durham, and I believe it was in Sedgefield in Durham, built in 1859. And as you can see, there's nothing left apart from a cemetery. So that's kind of an indication of where we're going to go with the asylums. The second one is in Cumbria. I wonder if people know where that is. That's in Carlisle. That's the Cumbria and Westmoreland Lunatic Asylum. And as you can see, the top bits are all flats. I think the only bit left, if you look, there's a kind of a V shape, or actually a W shape on those buildings, because some of the buildings were put into very posh flats. I had a look on Street Map. These are very, very posh flats. You couldn't afford to live there, basically, people. But that's what's happened to that old asylum. And the one in Middlesbrough, I don't know if people know what this one was. Anybody who's from TEWV in Middlesbrough? This was the first title was the Middlesbrough Borough Asylum, later known as St Luke's Hospital, which was finally demolished in 2010. So they have hung on for a while, but they've gone now, basically, or most of them have gone. And I don't know which bit's in Luke's, but I have a feeling this kind of patch of bare ground in the front, that's probably all that's left of those buildings. So the asylums basically have gone, I would say, physically. But I think for many people, when people think of wards, there is still a kind of lingering kind of asylum thinking around it, which I think is wrong. But we'll come to that in a minute. So the asylums have gone, but they've gone through a long process. And of course, in the death of the asylum was the birth of community services and the services that we now have. But the only bit of community services that is left kind of from that is, if you like, the fossil of the inpatient ward. But I kind of now wanted to move to thinking about where because that's ancient history. None of us can go back to 1845. But this is also living history, and that we've all lived this. Acknowledge it, but we have. And I wanted to just give people a chance to think about the time when they first came in contact with wards. Because wards, I think we have to admit, have transformed themselves over our living history. And it's something I think that we need to acknowledge a lot more, because although we've got a long way to go, we've actually come a long way. And if we're not careful, we can slide a long way back. So let's start with the death of the asylums in this little history lesson. In the 1850s, well, basically, before 1950, we obviously had quite a few things happening in the world. We had a world war. We had the inception of the NHS in 1948. We had massive improvement in medication and various other kind of advances in psychiatry in that way. So by the 1850s, people's eyes were looking at the asylums, and the Lucy Report of 1844 gives you some indication that asylums were set up for perhaps to be very beneficial places, but they often had problems, which we won't go into now. But by 1850, those problems were becoming very, very evident, because basically our asylums were overcrowded. We had just under 100,000 time in asylums, and there was in the 1950s, after the NHS came in, there was another kind of survey going around. This was the Percy Commission, which reported in 1957. And the Percy Commission, again, was quite damning of what was happening in hospitals. It found at that time, in the 1950s, that 46% of people in hospital had been there for more than 10 years, and 10% had been there for more than 30 years. So these were still long stay institutions where people were incarcerated for long periods of time. Of the people who were discharged, they found that 40% were discharged within 3 months, 80% were discharged within a year. So by 2010, those figures had been 80%. Those figures would be 80% discharged within 3 months and 95% discharged within a year. So, in the 1950s, these were big. The asylums were still there, but people were getting very concerned about them. And in 1961, we had the famous Water Tower speech. I'm sure I wonder if people know who made that speech. It was a Labour speech by a Labour minister, the very interesting Enoch Powell, who has obviously a tainted reputation for his later speeches. But in this one, he basically set out the agenda for the closure of the asylums. And it's very emotive language, and it's probably language that people know. There they stand, isolated, majestic, imperious, brooded over by the gigantic water tower and chimney combined, rising unmistakable and daunting out of the countryside, the asylums which our forefathers built with such immense solidity to express the notions of their day. And he was announcing that basically they were closing, that the intention was that they would finish. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody in this group was working on a ward in the 1950s, so we're not going to go there. But moving on to the 1960s, and we can see with the bed numbers coming down that this program had already started. It also combined, we have to remember, so Enoch Powell's is in the 1960s, 1961. Other things happened in 1961, which kind of also, I think, indicated a kind of a societal shift against the asylums. In 1961, Goffman's book Asylums was published, and we see various other kind of ruminations throughout the 60s of a different type of psychiatry. And in fact, people like David Cooper and R.D. Laing were kind of creating alternative kind of systems to asylums. I think often those people are presented as outside psychiatry, but indeed inside psychiatry, there are a lot of people interested in that as well. But basically, the bed numbers are going down. We're starting to see the asylum program closure starting. Now, I did once make the assumption that nobody in the room would be in the 1960s, and two nurses actually stood up and said who we were on wards in the 1960s. And one of them was Phil Burnham, and the other one was a guy called Tony Leba. These are exceptionally good nurses. So I think, again, we have to be careful. There were fantastic people working in those systems. but they were still big asylum systems. Now we come to the 1970s, and I put this one in because I first volunteered in a psychiatric hospital when I was 17, and that was, believe it or not, in the 1970s. It was 1977. And when I walked into an asylum building, it was what I considered to be a dreadful place. People didn't wear their own clothes. When you gave out a cup of tea, all the tea was made in one pot. The milk and sugar was put in, and we used to give 20 people the same drink from that huge pot. It was big enough to serve 20 people. So in the 1970s, we can still see that the bed closures are coming down, but this was my introduction on a ward. And I must admit that the first time I walked into it, the first thing I thought is, I'd like this place to close or definitely change. I'm wondering how many other people are in the room are kind of the same kind of memory. And I also wonder how many people have no memory at all of that kind of system, because it's within living memory that existed. So in the 1970s, the slide against the asylum continued. We can see the bed numbers going down. We now have the rise of what's then known as anti-psychiatry. David Cooper, in particular, is driving kind of anti-psychiatry. There's a huge kind of interest in psychoanalysis. I think at this point I should say that there's probably tremendous belief that the asylums and the need for inpatient care can go away altogether. I think that's floating around, and indeed some documents actually talk about the entire closure of all wards at points in this. Moving into the 1980s, which I suspect more of our group will. Now this is when I went into my training and actually actively went on towards and became very, very immersed in the culture, and that culture of kind of collective negative care, I would say, was very evident to me. The practices then was, you'd line up 4 men to bath them. One person would take their clothes off, one person would bath them, and another person would dry them, and there'd be a kind of conveyor belt. That was the culture in which I was working at the time, and that was in the 1980s, in 1983. And I should also say that at this point, learning disabilities and mental health were indistinct, really, in the asylums. The asylums kind of dealt with kind of a whole. They were either both together or kind of separate hospitals for the two specialities. I'm wondering again how many people worked, but again the closures were happening, and at this time, even as we were working there, we knew that there was a huge shift in moving out. And also in the 1980s, we saw the rise of the first real community services coming up. We had the first CPN teams, and then, of course, a drive to make that a kind of standard provision across the country, which again increased the drive to close beds, but also took resources from the inpatients to fuel those services. So many skilled workers were going out into community teams. So we come to the 1990s, which again, I think we've probably got more of the group joining, saying this is the first time they came towards. And I think the picture is becoming very, very different. You can see the massive reduction in beds. We're coming to a much tighter bed base now. We have lots of new builds and new kind of buildings going up, old asylums. If people are being housed, there's a massive kind of reprogramming. I think in the 80s and 90s there was also money sloshing around that was available for that kind of stuff. And in the 1990s, kind of to kind of cement that, we had a number of other things happening. We had I think one of the big things that happened was, up to this point, I would say, and Helen Gillespie, when writing about this, says there was a general, people were interested in the welfare of kind of inpatients, and there was a drive to put them out in the community. By the 1990s, as the community kind of, at the impact of that had started to happen, people also started to get concerned, and there was a certain amount of fear about people being out in the community. And I think that was compounded by the death of Jonathan Zito by Christopher Clunas, which happened in the 1990s. So we also saw, after the kind of iteration of people going out into the community, we started to see the first restrictions within the community. So CPA, which I don't think we would say is a restriction, was once described to me as therapeutic stalking by a service user. And we can certainly see in the 1990s a shift from needs assessment to risk assessment. So there was kind of a kind of psychological shift there as well. And the CPA and the Clunas and Jonathan Zito and risk assessment, we can start to see that there's also some concern about how do we actually manage some of the risks for people, both within inpatient services and indeed out in the community. In 1999, we had the National Service Framework, and I wonder how many people here could give me where in the National Service Framework it mentions inpatient wards. I wonder if people who were aware of the National Service Framework in 1999, which was the big kind of hope for the standards of mental health care in this country, because I can tell you inpatient wards and beds were not mentioned. Inpatient care was not mentioned. The only thing it said about beds was that it should be as near to the person's home as possible. So in many ways, again, I think the zeitgeist was very much, and I think I'm working on wards at this time in London. They were very busy, very acute. We'd often hear phrases like every admission is a failure. We are here to stop people being admitted. If we've admitted somebody, then it's a sign of failure. I think that thinking was wrong. I still think it's wrong. But while understanding where it came from, there was, I think, still a kind of feeling that basically one day we would do away with wards altogether. By the 2000, there was a bit of an understanding that we needed to include the wards. I think we'd settled down now. You can see the massive bed reduction over this period of time, which was still continuing and still continues. And in 2002, we had the Policy Implementation Guide, affectionately known as the PIG, for acute inpatient care. And, you know, with people coming onto wards at this time, they would have been very busy, very acute wards, much smaller than the old asylum ones that I went into, much more focused, much more CPA, computers, technology, all that stuff is happening in the 2000s. And then obviously 2010, which is where this graph runs up, that continues, but you can see that the bed base is continuing. I think we've just about put the brake on reducing the beds, and I think there is now a realization that the inpatient ward isn't going anywhere quick, but that we still need them within our modern mental health system. The reason I do that very simply is I have one of my pet hates is that when I sit with people, particularly kind of older professionals, doesn't have to be whatever the discipline, and when people say in my day, the wards in my day, because my whole kind of remit is the wards are constantly changing. If your day was 10 years ago, the wards are completely different to what you experienced and what you know. To be really up with this, you have to be actively going out, talking to wards and being there at the floor to understand the pressures that they are under. It wasn't better in anybody's day. There's never been a golden era of inpatient wards. That's to come. That's what we're driving ourselves towards. But it's never the fault of the people within it. There are huge systemic and political and societal pressures that hit wards, and we have to understand them, and we have to be tremendously sympathetic to people that work on them, because their day job is so busy that they can't stand above the noise and kind of take all this in as we are being able to do this morning. And whatever, there are good things about all of those times that we could bring back, but there are also bad things. And I do not want us to go back to the asylum era, but I want us to keep driving forward to kind of a better, and I truly believe in community care, but I think community care has to have as its bedrock the best inpatient care that we can provide for people that need it. So that's my little mantra, but I'll be very curious what that's triggered off in people's memory, perhaps when we come to the discussions later. You want to know where Star Wards and Safe Wards fitted in? Right at the end. Star Wards is 2004. So at the end of all, you know, we are talking about very, very recently, and Safe Wards is even more. Safe Wards is only 7 years old. So and Star Wards is, as Rod said, is 16 years old. So these are you know, we're blinks of the eye, but they were set up by people in that kind of system, coming into kind of care in the late 1990s, 2000s. But many of us in this room, when we think about it, can cast our mind back and remember that. And I think we should be telling the kind of younger professionals about some of that memory, because they won't know about it, but it is it is really important that we understand that we can go back. And if you go into Eastern Europe, you will still see, and other parts of the world, you will still see asylum buildings where people are not treated at all well. So we got to be careful in our drive to improve and some of the pressures that come around. And I've heard people say, you know, oh, we need to have bigger asylums, or wouldn't it be nice to bring back farms and stuff? And while I say you can bring back the farm, but don't bring back the asylum, let's try and keep our courage and drive forward for as good community care as we can. So wards are always changing, you know, wards will never change, they're stuck in. No, they've never been stuck. In fact, they'll change whether they like it or not. They've been changing my entire career. This is from Paul Elliott. Psychiatrists retiring at the age of 65 would have witnessed a total transformation of mental health services in their working lifetime. In the mid-60s, the health service located in large psychiatric hospitals. In the 80s, a second stage development with the establishment of dispersed community services. And if we think about that for a second, we are right in the middle of the biggest evolution of mental health care that's happened for over 200 years. We're right in the middle of it. We haven't arrived anywhere. You know, we're still pushing forward to try and make it as good as we can. And in the face of tremendous pressures. And actually, we'll come to this later, but tremendous negativity as well. People, you know, we saw that shift that people wanted the asylums to close, nicer kind of care for people to go into the community. And then when they arrived in the community, there's a question about whether the community was actually prepared for them. But we are absolutely in the middle of an evolution, and I think we have to keep our courage and sometimes realize that the problems that are thrown up are problems we probably could have predicted. They shouldn't be surprises. These are things we should start to get more in tune with and predict. One of the things that people say to me a lot is, oh, patients are much iller now than they used to be. And I hear that and I think that might be the case, but I wonder if there's a possibility there's something else going on, particularly if I'm talking to nurses who perhaps are from the 80s and 90s generation. Because if you think about this shift from the 1950s to the present day, in the 1950s, everybody with a mental health problem was in an asylum or there or thereabout. Everybody was deemed to have one. And asylums were full up with people who basically didn't need to be there. We have created a wonderful thing in community services that people who don't need to be incarcerated aren't incarcerated. So in 2020, the community has, and I would say, the more minor cases. Now, I've got to be careful here. These are people who have huge needs. I'm not denigrating. This is not a hierarchy of misery. I'm just saying they can be managed and can be helped somewhere else. So what does that leave for the inpatient care? And I would say it is the more severe cases. So is it that people are more iller, or is it that we just have a higher concentration of the most ill? Because that's what wards feel like to me. It's hard to get into them. I was listening to a talk the other day about the informal patient and how it had been completely changed from them. And we can imagine that an informal patient in the 1950s would have a very different experience to an informal patient in 2020. So one of the things I'm aware of that, and I think sometimes these patients are in a funny, if we're not careful, it's a funny kind of way of blaming the patient. And I don't think we should do that. I think we should step back from that and say, actually, if we have created inpatient wards that are basically full of very, very acutely unwell people, we need to acknowledge that in when we're thinking about what that means for the people that both receive treatment there, but also work there. You know, again, this is an indication that wards are very different places, and we need to be kind of in touch with what's happened to them. At the end of all this, I think that finally we come to the place that we are acknowledging that we cannot at the moment, and I think I would say I can't see a point in the future where we will ever be able to, we can't get rid of inpatient psychiatry. I think there have been various attempts to. I think we can do alternatives. I think we can chip away at it as much as we can, but we are still left with the reality at the moment that we need inpatient psychiatry. And this is Helen Gillespie writing in 2006, looking at the whole aspect of community care, and you can see that is. And to be honest, I've always felt this, that and it's to do with being up close with the patients I'm dealing with, and seeing the severity of the difficulties they're trying to deal with. and their families. I've always felt that we can certainly make it better, but we'll always need some place that they can actually receive some kind of, we can make things as safe as possible for them to heal. One of the things, and you'll get this from me, is one of the things that really annoys me is the fact that people just do not talk about inpatient wards. They're just kind of there. And there's still, I think, a great stigma and something wrong with being admitted. And this goes all the way down to policy. People will not acknowledge that we need to look at inpatient wards as a speciality, that people there are acutely unwell, and that we need to spend a lot more time thinking about how we help wards to manage that acuity rather than just get this, and this is from the Department of Health Community Care Act. So basically says an acute care need, an acute ward is for where people cannot be dealt with in the community. That's it. You know, it doesn't say anything about what less restrictive residential setting. But my argument would be, we say less restrictive residential setting, but systemically we have created restrictive residential settings. And just to kind of step back, this is a journalist. This is Patrick Coburn, is a journalist who's somebody whose son has a mental health problem. So he's kind of come to an awareness of psychiatry and through his son. And I would say that if we're not careful, that, you know, we can say that we want less restrictive inpatient care areas, but we need to do a lot more about helping people to make that happen. And the closure of beds and the concentration of patients has led to inpatient care that is concerning around restrictive practices. But again, I would say that this is something we should have been able to predict. This is something we should have seen coming as a consequence of community care, that people coming into hospital would have much higher needs, and we would need to create, you know, this should not be a surprise to us. We should not be paralyzed by this as a surprise. So part of my feeling about restrictive practice is something I'm absolutely passionate about reducing, is again that I am loath to blame the staff and patients on wards. I think that it's we've had a number of factors driving us towards this situation, and I see a lot of them as being systemic. The reduction in beds and other assets means that we have a higher concentration of acutely unwell people. The wards have also been asset stripped. I'm not going to say asset stripped of skills. I think people on wards are incredibly skilled, but it has been asset stripped of things like leadership. It has been asset stripped of certain members of the team. Social workers, for example, are now kind of a hidden mystery on an inpatient psychiatric unit, and you know, we need to put a lot more resources, particularly if we're acknowledging that the needs of people coming in are so high. And of course, because of the acuity of people coming in, there is a higher focus on risk and danger. Len Bowers did a thing about why are people admitted, and the key reason was because people were considered to be dangerous. So the trend has been to create more containing environments, at the risk of losing out on the kind of care or therapy of it. But again, I'm not going to come after the staff and patients, and I think there's far too much of that. I think we need to be able to stand back, look at this, and say we need to help people rather than condemn them. So I think it's time to kick back a little. I think my whole career has been kind of kicking back against blaming staff and patients. But of course, the question then is, how do we? And so I want to kind of take you into Star Wards and Safe Wards, because the interesting thing is about Star Wards and Safe Wards, you can see where they came in that pathway, was, and particularly Star Wards. When Marion kind of first floated Star Wards and put it out there, the people who kind of came on board, people like Rods, people like Ron up in Newcastle, were good people who were desperate for something that would, some kind of program really, that would help them to create more safer therapeutic environments. And Safe Wards has found the same response. Inpatient wards are desperate for any agenda that addresses what I've just said, that we want restricted practices to kind of go down, even in the face of the tremendous challenges that we are facing. Which doesn't mean to say there hasn't been resistance, but I would say that what the old asylum idea of good, well, basically this, we are looking for a shift from, and I'm not saying anybody here is a Nurse Ratched, but and in fact, I'm not even saying that Nurse Ratched existed solely in the places that we're talking about. But the asylum kind of culture also has with it a certain image, particularly of nursing, and that is the asylum nurse. You can't really change the culture of a ward. People need to be controlled. You can't let things fall apart. Now, calm down. The best thing we can go on is with our daily routine. And both Star Wards and Safe Wards have posited that actually that is exactly what you shouldn't do. That what we need to do to create this less restrictive environment is to actually give ward staff and patients the room to be therapeutic, the room to actually change their own environment. So, you know, the new Star Wards, Safe Wards nurse, the people who come on board in flocks are people who understand these issues and have the creativity and talent that have changed it. And I would say that everything I predicate, I'm going to talk about Marianne, I'm going to talk about Len, but none of, and even me, I haven't changed a ward in 10 years. The people who've changed are the people who take this on and take it into their ward. Again, the people who've made Star Wards and Safe Wards work are the ground floor workers on those wards. So how did Star Wards help? Star Wards came in 2006. There was a lot of negativity around inpatient wards at the time. You'd often see in reports saying things like inpatient wards continue to be a source of concern. They are untherapeutic places, often filled with unskilled staff because all the good staff have gone to the community. That was the kind of mantra. And I was on the wards at this time. I was on the wards in a total for over 20 years. So she founded it in 2006, and she founded it because basically Marianne, who's a remarkable woman, she went to Cambridge to be a lawyer, didn't like it, so she left, started a chocolate factory. She's a charity entrepreneur. She's a brilliant, intelligent, capable, funny, wonderful woman. She also has a recognised mental health problem, and in 1999 she had to go into a mental hospital, and the mental hospital wasn't a great one. It was St Anne's in Tottenham, but it was full of great staff, and she says that time in hospital saved her life. And when she came out, being a charity kind of entrepreneur, she thought she wanted to give something back. But she was struck when she went around by how negative people were about the staff. People would say things like, oh yeah, the staff are, you know, unskilled and all the rest of it. And Marianne said, actually, the staff are brilliant. It's the environment I want to change. And she changed that by coming along with a certain set of ideas. And the first one was positive appreciation. She wanted positive appreciation for the staff and the work that they did. And she wanted something optimistic and fun and set in the patient agenda. And we have a saying in Bright that serious stuff doesn't have to be boring. And it's one of the things when we kind of do stuff, anything, we kind of go, yeah, it's really good, but is it boring? And if it's boring, it goes back and it gets changed. And we wanted to produce a range of resources, patient-based resources that wards could pursue in the pursuit of the high standard of humane treatment. And when it did, we wanted to notice. We wanted to actually go out and say, when good people do good stuff, say thank you, notice, make sure it's given the credit it is. Far too much really good work just passes by people, and we need to kind of say thank you, and it's much more likely to kind of enthuse people to keep going. And crucial things, small changes make a big difference. I'll just tell a quick story. I'm being very careful about time because I've got a lot to get through, but I'll just tell you a very, 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 very quick story. When I was a student nurse, I got my first ward and I got all my patients together, and they thought it was a bit bonkers, and got them all together. And I said to them, I want to make a change on this ward. What's the one thing I can do that can change this ward? And as you know, I was thinking about, I just read all this stuff about, you know, psychotherapy and all that. I was thinking about talking therapies or running kind of educational groups. And the patients looked at me in stunned silence, to be quite honest with you. And then there was a hand went out the back, and she said, well, it would be nice if the Monopoly board had dice. And I always remember that because it was just like, oh my, and when I went and checked, she was absolutely right. There was no dice, jigsaw piece. You know, we can talk about all the highfalutin stuff we want. But, you know, basically, all they wanted to do was play a game of Monopoly, which is two different agendas there. So small changes make a big difference. Marianne got a lot of interest. One of the things Marianne was very good at was getting people to come on board, and people like the press. And I always find this article by David Brennan very interesting because he was kind of touching into something that I think is very important. Janner may have been the catalyst for Star Wars, but unleashed a deluge of creativity, energy, and goodwill that was there all the time in mental health inpatient system, but was stifled by the sapping negativity that surrounds it. The question I would ask you is, do we still have sapping negativity, and are we still fighting against it? How did Star Wars change wards? Now you're going out to do your big projects, and maybe some of you might think, oh God, I'll just check if there's enough dice in the Monopoly board as one of mine. But we say, look, you look at anything on a ward. If you go onto a ward and say, you know, you want to change it, anything you do, you can change it. But we think there are three types of change: tweaking, turning, and transforming. Tweaking is where you just, you know, you buy dice from the Monopoly board. I mean, you know, that's what you do. Turning is you go out and you, well, if you take the Monopoly, turning would be go out and buying a new Monopoly board, and transforming would be going onto the internet, finding the Monopoly board sets that you can do by yourself and creating one specifically for the ward. So, you know, even Monopoly, you can do tweaking, turning, and transforming. About exercise from inpatient services. In the old days when we were talking about tweaking way back in 2006, we were saying things like, why don't you buy an exercise bike, or failing that football, or a skipping rope, just anything. I mean, I know now this is passé. You got to go back to 2006 when this wasn't the standard on inpatient wards. These days you've all got this, haven't you? Most places have a gym somewhere, or setting up a gym, or doing something, and that's brilliant. That's really, really cracking. And then transforming. So tweaking is a small change. Turning is take further, requires some staffing changes and some new resources. And transforming is a bigger investment. And this is Navigo Healthcare. And the bigger investment there is Dave, Wacky Daggers Dave, the guy in the red tutu, who's a fitness instructor. And they pay for him to come in and run fitness sessions for the patients and the staff on the whole unit, actually. They have Fitness Friday. Don't be too impressed. They also have Donut Thursday. So it's not all. They're not all noble. And yeah, you take anything, music. So easy enough. Go out, go to your own home, pick up your old CDs, take them in, get other people to do it. That would be fairly simple to set up something if patients said they wanted more music, or the television off and an alternative. Many places, again, you're all going, oh goodness, we do this already. Good, so you should. But you know, musical instruments. But is there a way you can transform it? What about this? This is a longer stay unit, but this is a music and video suite, because many. Long story short, Bailey Hospital, Cigna Hospital in Yorkshire, realised that their patients stay longer, but a lot of them have actually quite a lot of musical and creative talent. So they built this music suite, and they have a guy who goes in one day a week and teaches everybody who's not mental health. He's just an instructor who goes in, teaches people music, video production, all the rest of it. So Star Wars kind of says that you can transform any inpatient environment you want. These are our 75 ideas. They are now 16 years old. And a lot of people come to them and go, oh, we've already got this. Because yes, believe it or not, things have moved hugely in the 16 years we've been doing it. You have changed inpatient psychiatry, even in the 16 years of Star Wars. And a lot of this stuff now is people go, you know, why would we not have that when 16 years ago they weren't there? Again, my point, wards are continually evolving, changing, moving forward. What we need to do is try and help them to move on that journey. This is freely available. People just, and the idea is people take this up, they go and chat to the staff and patients. But again, as you'll see with Safe Wards, we believe in change one ward at a time. Every single ward has to do this for themselves. So that's Star Wars. And it throws up some interesting things. We're going into nature and getting back to anything that's non-clinical, non-psychiatric. We need to do the clinical psychiatric stuff, so counterbalance it with other stuff. So this is a therapy dog who's actually a member of the team in Navigo. She has her own badge, Teddy. I think she'll be CEO one day, but don't tell anybody. I think she's that clever, Teddy. And we also have Bring Yourself to Work. Now, I think this is possibly the one thing that that people have really taken on. We didn't do this, but this is what we advocate. Staff and patients groups. So staff, RMNs, doctors, medics, people who know how to do medication, diagnose, DBT, all that kind of stuff. Patients in there because they're mentally ill or away from their homes. They have all sorts of risks. They have all sorts of needs. But they are also musicians and artists and animal lovers and sports fans and dancers and gardeners and singers and hen lovers and comedians and cookers and walkers and photographers and And what we're saying is, wouldn't it be nice if just some of that people were allowed to bring to the ward? So if your thing is photography, and I know there's a mindful photography thing up in somewhere in Newcastle, so I'm stealing from your own ideas here, people. But you know, all this stuff coming onto the ward is good stuff. Can any of this come onto the ward? So you can have, you know, all sorts of activities and various things going on. This is my cartoon for That's Wacky Daggers in the front getting, yeah, anyway, the pet therapy. Anyway, you can see what's happening. Okay, Star Wars. Now, before I go on to safe words, that's all very nice. That's all very nice. What's that got to do with restrictive practices? Very, very simply, and I won't go into this in great detail. When we ask people, how is Star Wars going down after 13 years? People are going, oh, it's great, patient satisfaction, much more activities, we all love it. And then they were saying things like, and we have noticed there's less aggression, there's less absconding, there's less use of the seclusion room. And that was a side effect of Star Wars. Star Wars never set out to do that, but it was a genuine side effect. That research is quite dirty, and it's not you couldn't kind of wave it around and be too grand about it. But it was very much a side effect of all that work, was that we were seeing a reduction in restricted practices. And there was somebody who noticed that, along with lots of other research. Len Bauer is kind of sitting over the Institute of Psychiatry, watching Star Wars, and Len's kind of one of those people who sits, watches the whole, he reads every piece of research. And he decided that actually you need to step forward and talk to people about safe wards, which was his idea about how we can make wards safer and indeed reduce restrictive practices. Now, I'm hoping at this point, as Rod said, you did have a little bit of homework, and that was Indigo's video. I hope you watched that. I'm not going to comment on Indigo's video because, you know, that's the only reason I put that in is I think it's about time here that you heard a service user voice. So you've already heard a service user voice. Marion Janner was a service user who created Star Wars. I am just speaking for her because she's retired. But safe words, I wanted you, first of all, to hear Indigo's voice because I wanted you to hear about why it's important from the patient point of view. Because all of this work predicates that we have got staff and patients working together. Now, Indigo presented it in her own inimicable way. I'm going to hit you, I'm afraid, with the Len Bauer's way, which is much more kind of rigid. But I'm hoping that you've all had a chance to see that and see how Indigo responded to that. Okay, Safe Words comes along in 2013. Star Wars has been rolling around for a long time. Rod and we love it. It's great. But, you know, we're just trying to make wards more fun, to be honest with you. Len Bowers comes along and his agenda is to make them more safe. And he has been 20 years looking at all this stuff with his teams, including me at times. And he is interested in reducing two things, conflict and containment. Two sets of behaviours, one set of behaviour demonstrated by staff, one set of behaviours demonstrated by patients. The thing that unites them is that they cause harm to someone somewhere in the system. I know in her video said she was a champion absconder and that she didn't come to harm for it. I'm sure she was actually. She did tell me her secrets, and I'm not going to tell you either because I've been sworn to see. Apparently, she has to kill me if I do. But anyway, but absconding doesn't mean that you come to harm. What it basically means is if you look at people who abscond from hospital, if you look at them as a group, they often stay in hospital longer and they often end up with more containing treatment. So it isn't that things that the person comes to harm, but that basically there's some negative impact of those behaviors. Medication refusal, perfectly understandable. To being again, that group kind of has all sorts of things happen to them. And the only other thing I'd say in containment is special observation is one-to-one close obs, and we put that in there because it's dubious if it works, and patients don't like it. Basically, it breaks and it harms their relationship with us, the therapeutic relationship with us. So these are all behaviours, and we're not making a value judgment. These aren't bad staff, bad patients. This is just stuff that happens that we want to understand and reduce. That's what Safe Words is all about. And Safe Words model is very important. And again, I'm not going to go into this in huge detail, but there's a couple of features I just wanted to point out. Along the bottom from left to right is the dynamic pathway to conflict and containment, which you can see over on the right-hand side. That double-headed arrow basically means that they are symbiotic. You have conflict, you have containment. But conversely, if you have containment, you can also get conflict. But the way that we get to that part of the dynamic pathway, and we very much believe if you're just looking at conflict and containment, you're a bit late, really. It's a bit like you're trying to stop the murder, but just keep finding dead bodies. You want to kind of get there before and kind of affect it. So we're looking at what leads up to conflict and containment. And we start from originating domains. And as we have seen, inpatient psychiatric wards are unique places in society, in history, and in every way. They are these unique places. And I would even say they're unique now, even to the wards that were there 10 years ago. But the originating domains, the kind of features of the ward, throw up for the staff and the patient what we call flashpoints. And these are situations, they can be practical or psychological, where there's some difficulty thrown up by the originating domain that the staff and the patient, and sometimes can be patient and patient, are going to have to resolve. The classic one is the Mental Health Act. Somebody gets admitted under the Mental Health Act, wants to go out for a walk, comes up to the door and says, "Can I go out for a walk?" And the staff member has no option but to say, to deny the request, to say, you cannot leave the ward. From the flashpoint, and we say when there is a flashpoint, we now have a situation where the probability of a conflict has gone up. How that flashpoint is managed or manifests itself then dictates whether a conflict or a containment actually happens. So in that situation, patient comes up, knocks on the door, I open the door, says, I want to go out and get a newspaper. If I respond with something like, "Oh, listen, I can get you a newspaper. That isn't a problem. In fact, I'll be delighted to, but I'm really sorry. I can't let you off the ward at the moment because of your section. Should we have a little chat about that and see if we can do something to make that easier for you?" That would probably be okay. But we could put me as a bad, but let's say, I'm having the shift from hell, life is terrible, my duty nurse just rung up, everybody's off sick, I just come back from holiday, there's 4 new admissions, I've got 6 OBS, the phone's going, CQC are about to arrive on an unexpected visit, and our dear old patient knocks on the door and I open it and I say something like, "What? No, you can't. Look, you're on section 3. Look, no, we've got no, look, I'm really busy now. I can't deal with this. Can you just go back to your room? We'll be with you in 5 minutes. Go back to your room. We'll try and get somebody to you in 5 minutes." Basically, we can see that that's managed in a different way, and there's perhaps a more likelihood that there'll now be a conflict, particularly absconding, to be honest. But so the model kind of says that if we look at conflict and containment, when we get to conflict and containment, we can see that these factors are operating before them. And crucially, how flashpoints are managed or indeed prevented really helps us to reduce conflict and containment. So if we're going to reduce conflict and containment, our real focus should be on trying to kind of interrupt that pathway at any point. And you can see that the staff and the patients above it are kind of having choices. So even if we get to a conflict, we can still kind of have a choice of manage that conflict in the least restrictive way. So even in that situation, if the patient kind of got agitated, I could, which would be a conflict if he told me to go and do one, I could then kind of calm down, perhaps apologize, and we could avoid the containment. So there's choices all the way along that. The 2 big challenges in this model are that if we look at longitudinal rates of conflicts and containment, that's conflicts and containment over time, Tompkins acute ward study, we see that conflicts and containment, certainly there is a range of it, but it is ultimately determined by the individual ward. So what we say is that the ultimate rate of conflict and containment, the staff on the ward have a huge part to play in what that final rate is. And they have a huge part to play in whether it's higher, so that's not a good outcome, but also whether it's lower. So the staff can actually affect over in the culture they create the conflict and containment. The second challenge is that often, and we still kind of, in our language, we talk about conflict and containment as almost coming from the patient. The patient was agitated, therefore. What we tend not to say is the patient was actually fine in the morning, but he wanted to ring his mum, but we put him off because we were busy, and then he came back 5 or 6 times, and he was getting wound up by this time, and then the shift changed. We didn't hand it over. Now he was really pissed off, and then he came up to the door and he asked, and when somebody told me he could wait 5 minutes, then he exploded. We tend not to realize that some of this conflict and containment isn't just the fact that people are unwell. It is well, I think we do realize actually, but we need to kind of think a lot more about how can we affect some of that frustration for both the staff and the patients. So the Safe Wards model says staff and patients, staff can make big changes, and staff are at top there because they have more power. We're not shying away from that. The staff are the ones because they have the power, but also a lot of that is understanding the patient's frustration is part of that. And SafeWords basically sets out to do that in a range of 10 interventions that have been crafted and chosen to do exactly that. And I'm not going to go into all of them because we just don't have time, but I'm going to focus on a couple. I'm going to look at one that's really lovely that patients love. There's websites you can look at all this. I'm sure you already have, but I'm going to look at just a couple, and then I'm going to take a dip into PMVA, but that's in a minute. So discharge messages. What's that all about? Just say all of the. Clear mutual expectations is about staff and patients sitting down and working out as groups. What are they? I always call this the Northern Irish Peacekeeping Agreement. In Northern Ireland, you might have noticed, but we had a little bit of trouble between our two groups, the kind of nationalists and the unionists. It might have passed you by, but it went on for about 30 years. And the way we resolved it was we all sat down one day and had a big conversation and worked out how we would be together. And I would say those are our clear mutual expectations. And that's what we want on wards. We're not shying away from them. There's two groups. There's a staff group and a patient group. But we're saying, let's get together and work out how we can both get through this thing called the ward and our time on it together. What's our expectations and can we stick to it? Mutual help meeting is that patients actually help each other quite a lot. All the research from patients says that there's a huge wellspring of support that comes, that is we find within the inpatient group of patients, and we want a meeting that effectively thanks people when they're doing that. That's the crucial part of that meeting, and then looks to see if we can increase the amount of help that people give each other. And we're not talking about, you know, filling in DLA forms. We're just talking about, you know, spending a bit of time when people don't have visitors, making each other a cup of tea. You know, it's low level acts of kindness, which are actually quite high meaning to patients. Talk down soft words I'm going to talk about. Know each other is an icebreaker for staff and patients to enable them to have conversations that aren't about staff and patients, that are about more neutral communal things like whether Newcastle or Sunderland are the better football team. I know we can perhaps talk about that in the next hour, although we'll probably spend the whole hour talking about that one. Discharge messaging I'm going to talk about. Countdown methods is when people are so agitated that we're thinking about something like PRN or some other kind of restriction, that this is a group of non-medical kind of items that patients can request, staff can give and offer, and that they can use that to try and help them in those moments. Positive words we're going to talk about. Bad news mitigation is spotting when patients have bad news outside of the clinical system or inside the clinical system, and making sure that they are sympathetically managed, and reassurances anything bad or unsettling happens on the ward to make sure that patients have an explanation. They can control their feelings on the ward if they know what's going on. I'm going to just dip into some of those in a little. So I'm going to have a look at discharge messages. Now, discharge messages, the power of discharge messages is actually on admission. We're looking for we're looking for an intervention that helps people on admission, because being admitted to an inpatient psychiatric unit is one of the worst experiences of anybody's life. It's terrible. It's dreadful. There's no getting away from it. You know, the stories of what people have had to go through to get to that threshold are just awful. They truly are. So there's very little as an inpatient worker you can do about how people arrive at your threshold. But what we say is once they step over the threshold, then we can start to make a different experience for them. And discharge messages is in that moment. We want to put something in the environment in that moment that somebody who's going through that trauma can see, and it's not going to make them feel better, but it just might give them a tiny bit of hope. And that's what a discharge message is. So we ask patients who are leaving, and we ask patients because staff don't know what it's like to arrive at that threshold. Well, they might, but it's not. It tends not to be the kind of experience of staff that they know what it's like to be admitted. They know what it's like to get to the threshold in that moment. The people who do are the people who are being discharged, who were freshly admitted a month or 2 months ago. They are the ones that know, and they specifically know what your ward is like. So we're asking them as they're leaving, and it's almost like, you know, you imagine they got their bag packed. Thank you very much. Got their bus pass. Off they go, and you're going, oh, listen, just before you go, would you do me a huge favour? We've got this idea, and what we'd like you to do is just write a message of hope, advice, or support for anybody who's going to have the experience that you've just had. you're coming to the end of it. You've survived and, got here. Could you just think about leaving something? And of course, many patients do. And if they do, we say that we will display them with the kind of the huge honor that we should, because these are gifts. So we have lots of trees because we put up a discharge message tree. We had places kind of going, we have a discharge every 3 years. This is going to get very depressing and a very small tree. So people who have less discharges have created walls of hope and have other ways of kind of harvesting those positive messages. And then we started to get clever people. This is Harbour Ward down in Dorset. So, of course, being Harbour Ward, they decided this ship sailing away into the sunset is what they wanted. So then, having one person having done it, then we had Cove Ward in Northampton going, yeah, well, if you're going to do that, we're going to have a lighthouse, which is great. This is all lovely. We love this. But my absolute favorite is this, and you haven't lost the abilities. That's Dutch. This is in Rotterdam. This is an 18 to 25 young male inpatient unit, and when they came to talk about discharge messages, went through the trees and everything, the young men sat there and went, nah, what we want is a getaway car. So we want the getaway car sitting there, and you can see it's pointed away from the unit so they can run out, jump in and zoom off into the Rotterdam hotspots there. So, and people put their discharge, the kids put their young men, they're not kids, put their discharge messages on Porsches and Lamborghinis and stuff. And you can hopefully get from this that, there's fun to be had in safe wards too. Len Bowers would hate me saying that because he's very, he would love me saying that actually. But yes, this is as much about, but all of that is a frame. The gifts that we get from the patients are often quite interesting. I've improved my mental health and have become informal. Turns out to be quite a common one, but very important. And you can think, if you're coming in on a section, here's a guy saying, I was here in a section and they took me off. It's actually a really important one. Choose the salad, be well, and you get to leave. Now, that might have no impact on you, but on that ward, it's a terrible joke. But the staff on that ward say, they often get patients going, what does this mean? When they're looking at this, and they end up telling the story of the young man who wrote it, who had a difficult time on the ward, didn't want to be there, and then staff and him really clicked, and they really helped him. And when he left, this was his. They said, but it's him. It's his sense of humour. It's really him, and it makes the staff smile when they walk past. But they say they often find themselves explaining it and smiling, and in the consequence, if you can think about that interaction, they're talking about an ex-patient with warmth, with generosity to a new patient, and that in itself is a hope-inducing kind of moment. This is from Ireland, the last one. So I have to do it in the accent. Staff very helpful, good days and bad. Chicken curry was lovely. Mary Sheehan. Now, I only put that one up because you'll see on the website that we talk about don't say thank you to staff. We don't want thank yous to staff. And we got kickback from the patient group, people like Indigo, and they said two things. First of all, these are our discharge messages. Don't tell us what to write, which is fine. And the second thing is actually a very hopeful message to say to people, the staff here are nice, the staff here are good. And even if it's down to, Madeline was really nice to my kids, or Billy really helped me with my forms, because it kind of really indicates to the patients coming in that you're people who are interested in them. And the caveat to that is that people have been on wards where staff haven't been so good. So we kind of retract that. But that's discharge messages. The power is on admission. It's a very dramatic kind of intervention. It's gone down very, very well. I'm not going to go through all 10, but I did want to just step, because I know there's people here very interested in PMVA, and there is a link with this, although it's obviously, we don't get into the far end of that right-hand diagram. That's not our area. That is PMVA, but obviously there is a link because PMVA is also actually trying to, although it's prevention and management of violence and aggression, prevention is kind of the big P there. So I'm often asked, is there anything in this? And I'll take this from Lisa Spong, who's a nurse in Australia, and she says that there are 3 interventions that fit in with kind of the PMVA agenda. And I'm going to speak to them very quickly, keeping an eye on time. Look at, if you're PMVA, go and look at these. Sorry?
There's 20 minutes to go. Just
20 minutes. Okay. I think, yes, I'm doing fine, Rod. Thank you. The first one is positive words. Now, I put that in the originating domains because obviously when we talk about, what can we affect? One of the things we want to change is before flashpoints have even happened. Can we have things, and what Safe Word says is even if you start to think about this, you'll probably start to prevent flashpoints. But positive words is about how staff communicate with each other about the patients. And we're particularly looking, to be honest, with nursing handover, because we believe that if we can make handover a positive kind of interaction and with positive words, then it'll probably lead on to more positive behaviours. Now, the way I'll say this is, I wonder how many of you recognise this as a kind of handover. So imagine you're coming onto your ward, you sit there, and the person comes in and they start off with something like, "Oh my God, what a morning. It's been dreadful. They've been, oh, Jesus, it's been terrible, terrible. They're just all over the place. They're crawling the walls. Everybody's kicking off. It's just ridiculous out there." Anyway, let me give you a handover. Teresa, personality disorder. Went to A&E last night, said she was going to kill herself. Must have been a junior doctor on, got admitted. So she's here. She's been with us before. We all know Teresa. And yes, she self-harmed this morning. Doctor's going to see her. Hopefully they're going to discharge her. But unfortunately, she's come in on a section, so we could be stuck with her for a while. Anyway, good luck with Teresa, and talk to the doctor and see if you can get her written up for something. Now, we say that isn't the positive words because we believe that does two things. First of all, staff coming on, it really demoralizes them. This is the kind of language and description of patients that really doesn't make you want to spend the next 7.5 or 12 hours sitting in that unit. And it does something else as well. It sets up you and Teresa, because really what it's kind of communicating is get your armor on. So the first time Teresa comes to the door, knocks on the door and asks for anything, you are primed, your armor's on, you're ready, and you're liable to open the door with something like, "Hello, Teresa, I hope we don't get this afternoon what we had this morning," or something of that ilk. So what we say is, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to blame, and I suspect if I look at my own career, have I ever given a handover like that? It's possible, people, you know, I'm not perfect. So we are asking people to actively think about how they hand things over and actively think about how they talk about patients, particularly unpopular patients, but all patients. And unpopular patients tend to be people with diagnosis of personality disorder or people who take drugs. So when we're handing over, we're looking for a handover that is hopeful and gives the staff coming in some kind of indication of anything that's positive that's happened in that person's care, or at least gives a psychological understanding of what the person's going through. So if I was to hand over to Teresa, it'd be more like, Teresa was admitted yesterday. She took herself to accident emergency. She's been with us before and she's been discharged. So things must be pretty bad for her. She doesn't like being in hospital, so I think we should keep in mind that if she went and asked, things must be pretty rough out there for her. She struggled since she's been here. The student nurse spent some time with her this morning, and I think she liked that, and that seemed to go down well. Shortly afterwards, she self-harmed, and I think that was when she was more alone and was ruminating. But if people could spend a bit of time with her, I think that would be very positive. She's finding it hard to be here. The doctor is going to assess her this afternoon. We're going to look at how we can help her. I hope it's not just medication. I think our emphasis here is to try and help her, but not have her on the ward too long. But while she's here, let's try and treat her like we did last time, because we did well with her last time and she got discharged to good effect. So that would be a kind of positive word handover of the similar situation. Now, I'm saying that as a PMVA intervention because, of course, we're interested in prevention. And what we want to do is to try and affect what happens in the flashpoint. So Lisa Spong in Australia sees that as part of a kind of a pathway towards PMVA, because staff going onto the ward are less primed. Another one, which is perhaps more obvious, is softwords, because softwords is interested in the flashpoint situation. So you've got a flashpoint happening, is how do we communicate? How do we actually communicate with patients? And I would say that the reason this is important is if you look at patient research, 35% of conflict, patients say that about 35% of the conflicts that they witness are predicated by what we call less than optimal staff communication. So it's, you know, the stuff that we all know. The staff have either been abrupt or more likely to have kind of passed somebody off, you know, the 5 minutes, give me 5 minutes or whatever, or just ignored the person. So it's about how the person has been communicated, particularly if there's a sticky situation. So soft words is a kind of an intervention that's aimed at helping staff to think in that moment. And soft words and talk down tips really are. I've got to be careful here, because we're not saying that we are, we're not saying we're educating staff. We're trying to remind staff. Staff are incredibly skilled and incredibly talented. This isn't about retraining them. We call these nudges. And if people are thinking, well, what does a nudge mean? A nudge is where you put something in the environment that is more likely to induce the behavior you want to see happen, which is all very nice psychological. But if you want to really know what a nudge is, think about men's urinals. Let's talk about men's urinals, people. If you want to understand a nudge, basically, and this Schiphol Airport, they had a terrible problem. They went in, they looked at men's urinals, and the amount of urine on the floor, as opposed to is in the urinal, was causing them concern. And they went, oh my goodness, this is terrible. This is a health hazard. How are we going to change this? And they sat down and they thought, oh, you know, should we put electric pads so that people get punished? Or no. They came up with, or should we re-educate all the people that come in, and you know, you can't go in unless you can prove you can pee properly, whatever. And they said, no, all we need to do is put a nudge in. The nudge that, and this nudge was very effective. I wonder if people know what it is. So they put something in the environment that would just nudge people towards the correct behavior by reminding them. They put a fly in the urinal so that men would come in and they'd wee on the fly. And the really classy ones, you have a football. So you go in, you try and score a goal. Now, the point I'm making here is men know how to wee. You know, all the women are going, no, you don't. But we do. We know how to urinate. It's fine. All we're doing here is reminding men. This is kind of like a little prompt. Wee on this. This is where you should be aiming. We're not changing anything else, but just giving them a nudge. And when you think about these things, don't think about re-education. Thinking about nudges. Think about how can we promote staff to do the best they can, to get those, to just remind themselves about how bloody skilled they are, because they are. And you go on to there's a whole lovely little slideshow about soft words, but I think this is the one I kind of picked up from the slideshow. So when we're trying to remind staff about that, we're reminding them that whenever nurses have to respond to patient requests, ask patients to do something or stop them from doing something, the temperature can rise and there is a risk of frustration and wounded feeling on both sides. Patients can feel humiliated, disrespected and treated like children. Occasionally this escalates to conflict behaviour such as verbal abuse or even physical violence. So what we're looking for here is something in that environment that just reminds us about how we should communicate in those sticky situations. And I've picked out, there's over 300 of these nudges, and wards should use them in the way that they want to, but I just wanted to show you some. So let your whole manner express genuine respect, empathy and warmth for the patient as an equal. Verbally show your understanding of how frustrating or difficult this might be for the patient. Imbue that empathy for their viewpoint with warmth and genuine positive feelings for them. So that's just a general one about your general manner. And this is asking somebody to stop. Ask a patient to stop. Do not order. This is much more likely to elicit cooperation and avoid the power struggle. Do everything to avoid insistence or a show of force. So if you're going to ask somebody to stop doing something, it's ask them, would you mind? I'd be ever so grateful, that kind of thing. First reflex should be saying yes, not no. Do you really need to say no? Can you justify saying no? Is this something with a bit of work of effort or checking you say yes? Yes to. So the example I gave, somebody on a section 3 come up, can I go out for a walk? No, you can't. You're on section 3. It's not the greatest way to, do you know what? You know, I'd love it if you could. I'd really like that to happen, unfortunately. And for some people, the word no is a trigger in itself. So we have now got wards where they have competitions about not saying no. Anyway, so that's denying a request. If you've got to sort of not, if you can't give the patient what they want, think about it. And then be flexible. It isn't always necessary for an individual to do exactly what you tell them to do. So this is about asking somebody to do something. So depot day, John really doesn't want it. You go say, come on, John, you know, we've got your depot ready. And he says, oh, listen, I'm just going to finish my coffee. I just need to go for a cigarette. You might want to say, yeah, OK, take a couple of minutes. That's fine. And I'll come back and get you, or come and knock on the door when you're ready. That kind of thing, rather than, no, John, come on, it's there. We need to do it now. So again, going back to PMVA, Lisa's point, I can't do that. Lisa's point is that if we can get these right, we can basically kind of stop us even needing to kind of think about it. So moving on, we now have the talk. Now, we do have conflict, and we're not pretending that we don't. We do have people who are agitated, and as we've already seen, we've got higher concentrations of them now than we did 50 years ago. So we have a lovely thing called Talk Down Tips, which is the biggest nudge you can imagine. This is Lindsay Bennett, and she is not a midget. She is in Northampton. She is a normal-sized human being, which just tells you, and I've been told I'm not allowed to swear, so it just tells you how very big that poster is. That is a monstrous poster. That's an A1 poster that should hit you in there. This is not so much a nudge, it's picking you up by the collar, swinging you around the room and making sure that you pay attention kind of thing. So that's Talk Down Tips. Why? Because it's a skill that inpatient nurses excel at that is absolutely brilliant. De-escalation, or let me put that correctly, good de-escalation is just the most incredible thing. It's brilliant, it's beautiful, it's an absolute thing of beauty. One of the things we say about this intervention is get onto your ward, find out who is a good de-escalator, make a little pedestal for them, get them to stand on it and cover them in rosebuds, because they stop so much stuff happening on your ward. We want to be as good as them. And the intervention as such describes good de-escalation in some detail. The intervention, we ask the people who are good to just, everybody gets a good look at this nudge, and all new people coming onto board say, this is our standard of what we want with de-escalation. The red bit in the middle is the actual act. So when you get there is to control the situation, so you can make a contact with the person to clarify exactly what's going on for that person, showing them respect, so that you're always looking to move to a resolution where they can step down from their agitation without a show of force or a loss of face. The two big blue things are the behavior of staff that we want to see. Total respect and empathy for the patient all the time, a real respectful attitude, but also the ability to control your own emotions, even if you're very anxious and very scared, is to control that and to seem that, so that the patient can have confidence that you truly are able to kind of take them to a calmer place because you yourself are in control. All of these are kind of said in much greater detail on the website. Sorry, I'm jumping around. So if you're PMVA, if you are interested in PMVA, do go and have a look at those things. Email me as well, or I put you in touch with Lisa. But there are people, what we're seeing now is that particularly Talk Down soft words is people taking them into their PMVA training. And what we would say is that we want people to go off in the PMVA training. The kind of the virtuous circle for us is if they see Talk Down Tips and go through it in the training, that if the nudge is there on the ward when they return, it will kind of keep them fresh, keep them honest. And if people are talking about it on the ward, it's more likely that we'll see a lot more good de-escalation on wards. So that's which one we're talking about? Safe wards. I get them mixed up in my own head. That's safe wards. I'm not going to go through the evidence, just simply because it's rock solid. Randomized controlled trials, evidence from Denmark, evidence from Australia, evaluations. It's much bigger evidence based than Star Wars, but it really kind of puts the nail into the message that if you do these positive things, the negative things reduce. There is a balance here. We're doing a lot of positives and we're seeing a lot of the negatives reduce. I usually sing, you've got to accentuate the positive to eliminate the negative at this point, but we haven't got enough time and Rob wouldn't let me. Does it work? It works. Yeah, the evidence is there. But this for me is much more important evidence. This is the dear old CQC going around 2017 and then writing in their state of care report, you know, they went to a ward, you can read it, ward got better, they did safe wards approach, things were better, but the bit in yellow is the bit, and I'm so glad they said this because this is exactly right. The success was due to the genuine staff engagement and buy-in to the idea of using safe wards techniques all the time, not because somebody told staff to do it, because they believed in it. That's exactly right. These staff, and I don't know where this is, there's no reason why I should, but these staff were brilliant, as many staff are. Interesting caveat to that was I got a phone call in 2017 from the CQC saying, could you come and tell us what this safe wards things is, because we don't know. So they do know now, because I've been around to all of them, and the one thing I said is, you know, if you see it, give people positive strokes, because it's a big ask. It takes about 2 years. Even STAR wards and safe wards, you're talking about long-term change. So these programs take two plus years to kind of put into place. They've been adapted for learning disabilities, forensics, for older adults. And there are some adaptations, but we're now looking at a real good adaptation for CAMHS wards. So, and we're using that from people who've already adapted it. So wards have used it, and now we're learning from what they've done to make it kind of better. And it's not just the CQC. I like this study very much because it's the cross-national mixed method comparative case study of recovery-focused mental health care planning and coordination in acute inpatient mental health setting. The COCAP study, I have been known to call it the COCAP study, but that's just because I can't deal with the title. But it's not, it's actually a brilliant study. I'd recommend reading it. And it just and they went out, talked to wards, and what was lovely for us again was they found that there was a lot of positive stuff. The person who rang me up and said this was, and he started off by going, do you know what? I was pleasantly surprised. And then he went on to be very nice about wards. And I said to him, why were you pleasantly surprised? I've known this for years. Wards are really good places. They struggle. There are some difficult ones. But, people out there are amazing. They are doing incredible things. So don't be pleasantly surprised. Don't be surprised. Go out and expect it. Find it. It's there. The widespread commitment among staff to provide safe, respectful, compassionate care with strong values underpinning practice. The other reason I want to come back to this is remember that David Brindle quote in the 2000s, and remember the 1980s. We have a problem with inpatient wards. It's full of it has no activities and unskilled staff. We don't say that anymore, and I'm very glad. And we should never say that again, because it was never the case. A variety of initiatives to improve inpatient were described by staff. So we now have a situation where we've got the Royal College of Psychiatrists, AIM Productive Wards, Bright Charities, STAR wards, safe wards, quality improvement programs, and support from housing and peer support workers. There's a lot going on out there. And our point is that whatever you're thinking of, if you've got some idea of improving, somebody's done it. And if you go and ask them, they'll tell you how to. There are a range of other, they just mentioned a few, but you dip into it. There's so much wealth out there in terms of ideas, from the tidal model, from refocusing, which was, he was Ian, can't remember his name, but it's all about looking at the role and function of acute inpatient care. So, for example, why is somebody admitted? Actually having a reason for admission beyond, well, he's mentally unwell and dangerous. It's like, well, what are we actually trying to achieve in this admission, and can we actually make sure? How can we measure to make sure that we're achieving that, and does that fit in with recovery? That's kind of refocusing. Sainsbury's acute care project. We are going back a few years here. These are all things from the night, but they're all very good. Acute care forums across the country are still in existence, but the original idea of an acute care forum is a very good one, that you have a central place for a hospital where the whole safe ward, STAR wards that is kind of focused on. I'm sure you have these. The London and Northern collaborative projects, which were run nationally, AIMS, the RCN's Central for Quality Initiatives, Build, if we're talking about learning disabilities, excellence, Tizard Centre as well, if we're going to go for learning disabilities. Productive Ward, I think the kind of vehicle of, the box and all the rest of it might have put some off, but there's some brilliant stuff in Productive Ward. Meal times, handovers, and just, creating more time for people. 6 categories intervention, which is kind of around seclusion, data use, CNTW do this 6 categories intervention really, really well in their kind of models. They probably wouldn't say that, but that's really, they are exemplars at that. Safety huddles, it's a new thing come in. Love it, love it, love it. Get people together and talk about how safe the words, how can we do it? Maybe chuck in a few STAR wards interventions. I like safety huddles with hot chocolate, people. That's one that I'm hearing, which is really good. Positive behavioral support. I know it came from learning disabilities for people in mental health, but it's got a lot in it. Go and have a look. It is very, very good. Talk First, which is exceptionally good and kind of amalgamates all that. And people are doing a lot of their own QI initiatives. But, and I haven't really talked about this because it's not my place, but I think, and this is sitting on the sidelines, watching this group going, oh, please, please, we need a lot more of this, is I think the future, the real future will come when the patients start telling us what we should do. And I think people like Indigo and Marion and indeed Paul Sams, and I'm sure there are others up there, these are the people that are really going to help us with the next iteration, because it's their perspective and their kind of changes that will really, I think, make the big difference in the next wave of whatever we do. Some interesting new initiatives that have just come off the block, which are I'm looking at because I love them, but I'm always really TRN. TRN is a thing that Priory Hospital is doing, and it kind of fits in with that comfort box thing I mentioned in Star Wars, where we have an alternative when people are agitated. They've decided they actually have a range of herbal teas, and I can't do the thing, but the herbal teas, it turns out, have psychological benefits. So you can have herbal teas for sleep, you can have herbal teas for stress, you can have herbal teas for agitation, you can have herbal teas for low mood, you can have herbal teas for obviously upset stomachs and all those kinds of things. So they actually have a menu which their patients can come and they can request a herbal tea of their choice, and they get that herbal tea depending on what it is that they are trying to manage. I'm giggling to myself, but it's not funny. In fact, I think it's lovely, and apparently it's gone down a storm. So there's a 29th of September this year, just an update. TRN has been a success so far. We've had patients who have used this for sleep, nausea, pain relief, and other ailments. Feedback has been great, and the use of PRN is creeping down slowly but surely. You know, we're looking to reduce PRN. You know, our focus here is we need to reduce the restrictive thing of PRN. And if somebody came along and said, yes, let's get some tea in, you'd probably laugh them out. But look, there you go. There's a positive leading to a reduction in a negative. Because the use of, and you've got to be careful, because some people do need PRN. I don't think it's ever going to get down to zero. There's always going to be some patients who are going to need that PRN. But for the people who you can have an alternative, this is great. And the CAN card fits into that. So this is something that's put on people's, this has come from Safe Words, but people have just this is adapted this since we've been doing countdown boxes, and it's a thing on the medicine chart that says, so you ask the patient when they come in, if in the future you are having a difficult time, and is there anything that we could provide reasonably that could help? So it might be get me a phone call to my mom. I'm trying to think, have a cup of tea is another big one, chat to a nurse, so it's just things that might be offered to somebody before you kind of go for PRN. And of course it can refer back to TRN or the comfort box if necessary, but it's just a nice touch. And I think one of the things about all this stuff in PRN is, if patients see us genuinely saying we'd like to offer you an alternative, then they're actually they're not happier about accepting PRN, but it's less like we're peddling just medication. It just feels to them that we're looking for alternatives, even if there aren't any, and even if we eventually give the PRN, the whole process of that is a positive thing. And this is the RAP project. This is just something that I've always been thinking about. The RAP project provides parcels. The way they do it is brilliant. They've done a whole science. So those parcels are very carefully chosen. So you have a parcel on admission that's to help you with admission. So this is stuff that could help you kind of be a little bit more comfortable on the ward. And then you have a pack for discharge, and it's different because they've now thought about what you need for discharge. So you've got stuff in there like if you're going home, it's a toilet roll, enough for a basic meal, enough to get you through, that day, that evening, if you're going back to a cold, empty flat that's got nothing in it. So this is very, very careful thinking, and it's lovely because it's designed for patients, by patients, for patients. There's a little charity, Reinstate, they've done that. And it's in the zeitgeist. There's Natalie Brown up in Northumberland who does discharge packs. There's a lot more thinking about, rather than just discharge people, can we think about what that experience is? Can we make it safer? And again, I think if we're looking at things like, and this might sound like a leap, but if we're looking at things like preventing suicides, a lot of suicides happen when people leave the ward, go home, that first 2 weeks, it's very depressing, they're not in contact with services, and the kind of discharge shock kicks in. So something here that would a gift from us to carry them over that, with perhaps things like the names of phone calls of people, perhaps even a free coffee in their local place, just something to reintroduce them back into the community. That's a really good thing. So these are new initiatives kind of floating around there, and a lot of them are coming from thoughts that patients themselves or ex-patients are having. So
Geoff, I'm so sorry to interrupt. That we're 5 minutes over, and
okay, I'm gonna just end with, don't do it this way. Star Wars is all about empathy and compassion, so be nice to the staff. I was just going to end by saying you need logic, passion, and instinct. Marion and Buddy and Len, they have the lot. In summary, motivation is about respecting staff, and let's stop the negativity and recognize that over years, staff and patients have done this, and nobody's, they've done this themselves. And we should be lighting a fire in them, not under them. Has to come from the ward. But we do have an expectation. If you're not doing some of these things now, why not? What else are you doing? How can you help? How are you making a difference? Because unless somebody like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. That's me done. Traditional quote, and a really good team. Because look at those smiles. And that's me done, right? I'm done. That's how you motivate people.
Brilliant. Geoff, can I just on behalf of everybody thank you for a really inspiring, thought-provoking talk this morning. Absolutely fantastic.